On January 31st, 1989, in Heze, Shandong Province, China, most of the residents were at home preparing for the Chinese New Year, with there thus being few witnesses as to the horrific event to come. At 1 p.m. that day, a woman entered a public toilet and her screams later alerted the other residents, as when they rushed over to see what the issue was, they found the body of a young girl. The police were quick to arrive and begin investigations. The victim had been stabbed multiple times, with 5 of the wounds being fatal. According to those at the crime scene, the body belonged to a middle school student living in a family courtyard and with parents who worked at a machinery factory. A coroner placed her time of death very recently. In fact, it was placed at an hour before discovery, and due to a lack of defensive wounds, it was theorized that the killer was waiting inside the public toilet for a target and struck almost as soon as she entered, and according to residents, no struggle was heard from inside the toilet. The identity of the victims appears to have been withheld. The victim did not have any money on her, and interviews found out that she didn't have any on her before, so alongside the MO, this was used to rule out robbery. The police then pondered whether this was the result of a revenge killing, and conducted a thorough investigation of the neighbors and her parents' colleagues at the factory, but none of them had a reason to take revenge, or even opportunity to commit the murder if they did, since all had alibis. The police then shifted focus over to a crime or passion and questioned her fellow students and learned she didn't have a boyfriend or any romantic interest, so it couldn't have been a case of battling for someone's affections. The students also all had alibis. The case eventually became unsolved and was simply ruled as a random murder, with the killer having likely fled. In mid-February, there would be another incident as a woman was found dead inside the restroom of a Xinhua bookstore under eerily similar circumstances. The police were at a loss with this case, as well as unable to find any suspects or even uncover how this crime occurred, since the bookstore had security guards and numerous people regularly going in and out during daylight hours. 2 more incidents would also occur and be linked to the same culprit, as a girl would be murdered at a bus station and a teacher at the local school would also be murdered. As expected, panic soon set in by now, with women in the area often refusing to enter any public restroom and having relatives escort them to and back from work. Meanwhile, at the local schools, the male teachers started standing near the restrooms, acting like security guards, and the female students were forbidden from going to their dormitories alone and had to be escorted by their male teachers, with the dorms being locked from the outside until 8 a.m. On March 11th, there would regrettably be another murder. 2 women entered the bathroom of the Industrial and Commercial Bank of Dongming County. One was a 25-year-old cashier of the bank named Shen Zuru, and the other was a 21-year-old farmer from a local village named Sui Aixa. The news about the murderer had not yet reached their local area, so the 2 saw no reason to practice caution when entering the restroom. As soon as they entered, a young man was quick to pounce on the 2, hitting them on the head with a brick and beating the 2 into unconsciousness before they had a chance to call for help. He then, using a knife, removed their genitalia, placing them into a black plastic bag before fleeing the scene. The 2 were later discovered alive and quickly rushed to the hospital, where Chen would pass away, and Sui would be left severely disabled for the remainder of her life. After this case, the police soon created a dedicated task force to investigate this case, pulling in various investigators from Shandong Province's Heze, Jue, and Wancheng areas, as the culprit had struck in all of those locations. The task force linked a total of 22 crimes to the culprit, nicknamed the Perverted Specter of the Heze public toilets, often shortened to just the Perverted Demon of Heze. He had committed 5 murders and 18 assaults, not resulting in death. 18 took place in broad daylight and only 4 at night, and of those incidents, 20 of them occurred in a public restroom, 1 occurred somewhere else indoors, and 1 happened outdoors. Due to a lack of sophisticated means of investigation at the time, the authorities relied on interviews and wanted bulletins detailing the suspect's description. According to survivors and other witnesses, the culprit was a young male over 170 centimeters tall with fair skin and wore a woolen coat while using a motorcycle to escape from the scene, both of which was something most at the time couldn't afford. The motorcycle explained many things to the police, mainly that the killer was well off or from a well-off family, and also how he struck in so many areas, as investigators initially believed he had to live nearby, but due to the motorcycle, he was instead able to live a great distance away from his crimes. The police investigated all in the area who owned her motorcycle, but each had alibis. Lastly, police determined that he likely had military training due to the brutal efficiency he utilized when carrying out his crimes. The task force also went on television and told the few people watching the situation and how they needed to remain vigilant and offered a reward for anyone coming forward with information. Meanwhile, squatters would station themselves outside any public restrooms hoping to catch the killer themselves. These efforts succeeded not in catching the killer, but instead in scaring him off as he never struck again. The only viable suspect at the time was a copycat who imitated his method of waiting in the toilet to rob women, as opposed to murdering them. He was arrested but later ruled out as being the original killer due to a lack of opportunity to commit the crimes. The investigation was halted in 1994. 13 years after the first murder, there would finally be another suspect. By February 13, 2002, Heze had undergone numerous urban development projects and was now a rapidly growing and prospering city, as opposed to the rural backwater it had been during the 1989 serial killings. On this day, 2 cleaners were sent to clean a public restroom just south of the Heze long-distance bus station, but upon entry, they discovered the naked body of a woman and quickly called the police. The police quickly arrived and made the case the top priority, as not only did they still remember the serial murders, but most of the officers at the time had actually worked the case, so it didn't take long for them to fear a re-emergence of the killer, but also were hopeful that modern-day forensics would finally result in an arrest. The body was lying perfectly straight at the northwest corner of the bathroom, and medical examinations placed the time of death at around 10 to 11 p.m. on February 12th, although stomach contents provided a much more specific estimate of 10:30 p.m. Her left breast and genitalia had been removed from her body using sharp tools. Since it was late at night, the police had no witnesses to question. The deceased was identified as 19-year-old Pan Honying, who had come to Heze to work as a waitress 5 months prior. The killer had left behind traces this time around, including a bloody palm print on the walls left using his right hand, 2 coins, and a burned lighter windshield. The police, however, weren't the only ones who had a vivid recollection of the case, since the panic from 1989 soon started up all over again as the general public feared the return of the perverted demon of Heze. Pan's boss and co-workers were questioned when they stated that she needed to use the bathroom, but couldn't use their establishment's restrooms due to them being at max capacity, so she was granted permission to leave for a public one, with that being the last she had ever been seen alive. Pan was described as an honest person, and during her time in Heze, she had not fallen in love with anyone, and nobody was known to have taken an interest in her. Meanwhile, Pan's family in Zhejiang province did not have any enemies, and it was determined unlikely that somebody traveled thousands of kilometers to Heze in Shandong province to track down and kill their daughter 5 months after the fact, for matters that were likely trivial in nature. Robbery was also ruled out, since in the 5 months she had been working, she only made 1,200 yuan, 1,000 of which she sent back home, and never wore any valuable jewelry. The police focused their initial investigations on those who may pass by the area late at night, which wouldn't have been many since February 12th was the Chinese New Year. The police comprehensively checked the internet cafes, dance halls, movie theaters, shampoo rooms, and supper shops that were still open that night near the East Bus Station. No persons of interest were found. On February 14th, the police would receive a lead. A taxi driver reported that 6 or 7 young people got into his car at Zhizhou Property Market at around 12 p.m. on February 13th, and one of his passengers said, "Do you know, a woman in a bus stop toilet was killed and her breasts were cut off." This was most curious, as the body wasn't found until 7 a.m., so the only way anyone would know about this case would be if they had involved themselves. The taxi driver described the man, and on February 16th, the man was arrested, and as it turned out, he was a 16-year-old boy named Wang Chuanlong. Wang had dropped out of school and was unemployed, but not much is known about his background. On February 12th, Wang was at a disco in a mall in the Zhizhou area, only 800 meters away from the crime scene, and had left at 10, which provided him with the means and opportunity to commit the crime, and he was quick to confess. Wang described in detail how the crime had been committed, and even told police about his 4 accomplices, which was the first sign that something was wrong, as based on footprints and the forensic evidence, there would have been only one killer. More inconsistencies piled up, since Wang couldn't describe what had happened to the murder weapon or Pan's clothing. The police questioned his 4 alleged accomplices, and discovered that all 4 of them had airtight alibis. And lastly, the palm print found at the scene didn't match Wang's, and assuming Pan's case was connected to the 1989 murders, Wang couldn't be the killer due to his age, and yet he insisted on confessing. The police tried various methods to get the truth out of him, including having his family talk to him, but he couldn't be swayed from his confession, stating that he's only confessing to prevent wrongful convictions. Although he hadn't been released, the police continued their investigation, having practically ruled Wang out as a suspect, in all but name, despite his insistence that he was the killer. On April 17th, an employee of the Heze Zhanxing moving company reported to police that he had suspicions that his coworker may have killed someone. The employee was 27-year-old Gang Yinjun, who was described as an easily irritable alcoholic who was in Heze at the time and had the means and opportunity to carry out the offense. Gang had left Heze 2 days prior to the report, but based on the location of his mobile phone that he kept on him, he was strongly believed to be the killer. On May 11th, Gang was arrested in Zhuozhuo, where he had fled to, and initially didn't know why he was being arrested and shouted "wronged." But when he found out that the Heze police were involved in his apprehension, he soon confessed. According to Gang, he was depressed due to not earning much money and had a drink at a friend's house on February 12th and left his friend's house at 9 p.m. and arrived at Heze bus station by taxi at 10. He was wandering along the road alone when he saw Pan enter the public toilet. He followed to try and peek on her, only to be noticed by Pan, who promptly screamed. Gang, in response, hurriedly grabbed her neck and ended up strangling her to death, although it's unknown whether her death was intended or not. After she had died, Gang proceeded to molest and mutilate her post-mortem in order to disguise the motive of the crime and mislead investigations. He said that he disposed of the severed breasts and her clothing in a pond behind Heze No. 1 Middle School. On May 12th, a salvage operation was carried out, and the physical evidence was recovered from the pond with the daggers used to mutilate the body, alongside Pan's breasts and clothing being recovered. Unfortunately for investigators, however, was that this case was simply an isolated incident and Gang wasn't responsible for the 1989 murders, as he didn't live in the area at the time, and even if he did, would have only been 14 years old. Further information on Gang, such as his sentence, is unknown. There was still one last question, however. Why did Wang confess, and how did he know so many details about the crime? Well, as it turned out, he actually discovered the body before the cleaners did, but simply refused to report it. His confession was a result of arrogance, a desire for infamy, and simply ignorance of the law. He wanted the infamy that came with killing so he could brag about it and claim to be a murderer to intimidate people, and falsely believe that due to being 16, he would face zero punishment as opposed to more lenient sentencing. The police released him with a very stern warning, as well as imposing mandatory education and psychological treatment. It appears that Wang hasn't graduated to killing people for real. Although the murder of Pan Hongying was found to be an isolated incident and solved, the true identity behind the perverted demon of Heze was never uncovered, and his murders remain unsolved 33 years later.